Hi, I'm Justine Burke.
Hi, I'm Lance Samard,
Welcome to the Pharmaphile.
where medicine meets mystery.
So today we are opening a case file that is, well, it's a really contentious one. It sits right at the intersection of what looks like brilliant engineering, some truly radical scientific claims, and I think a hope that never really goes away for a perfect cure.
A painless one.
Mm,
That's the key. And you're right, we're talking about Royal Raymond Rife and the Rife Machine.
that's it. This is, a foundational story in the world of alternative health. But to really get it, you have to go back almost a century.
You do. You have to understand the world he was operating in back in the early 1930s. We have to start with the man himself, the man who claimed he could see what no one else could.
Okay, so let's set that scene. We're in Southern California, it's about 1930, and our central figure is Royal Raymond Rife. The first thing to establish, and it's probably the most important thing, is who he was. He was not a physician.
No, not a biologist, not a doctor. He was an engineer. By all accounts, an incredibly talented one. A tinkerer, an inventor, really obsessed with optics and precision mechanics.
And from his lab, he makes this claim that just sounds like pure science fiction for the era. He says he can see living viruses.
Which was, functionally impossible at the time. Viruses were understood, sort of, but only by their effects. They were these mysterious agents that were small enough to pass through any filter that could stop bacteria.
So they were, for all intents and purposes, completely invisible.
Completely. The way you studied microorganisms back then, the standard laboratory microscopy, made it impossible to see them alive anyway.
Right, can you walk us through the standard process?
Sure. The protocol was all about fixation and staining. You would take your specimen, your sample, you'd kill it, and then you would use chemical stains to create contrast.
So you could see the different parts under a regular light microscope.
Exactly. You were basically studying a photograph of the organism, a static, dead thing.
And Rife saw this as a huge problem.
He saw it as a betrayal of the whole point. He argued that if you kill the organism, you're not studying life anymore. You're studying its corpse. His entire mission was to see these things alive, moving, interacting.
And that idea alone was a massive departure from how science was done.
A huge departure.
So how did he claim he was doing it? If it wasn't just about making a more powerful lens, what was his secret?
It was all about his custom optics. He built his own microscopes from the ground up. We're talking complex arrays of quartz lenses.
Why quartz?
Because quartz can transmit a wider spectrum of light than glass can. Specifically, it lets ultraviolet light pass through, which was key to his whole system. He also used these precisely aligned prisms and a special kind of illumination he called polarized illumination.
Okay, so he's using a different kind of light, but how does that let him see a virus?
Well, this is the core of his claim. He wasn't using stains to create contrast. He was using specific wavelengths of light. He said that when he looked through his microscope, he'd see these luminous glowing forms against a completely dark background. Glowing. But here's the kicker. The forms would only appear at one very specific wavelength. If he shifted the dial just a tiny bit, they'd vanish.
Wow. Okay, so that observation is everything.
It's the cornerstone of his entire theory. He interpreted this to mean that every organism has a unique optical signature, a specific frequency of light that it reacts to.
So visibility wasn't about size, it was about synchronization.
That's the perfect word for it. He believed the organism only revealed itself when the light illuminating and the organism itself were in a state of resonance.
The light had to be tuned in to the microbe.
Exactly. Tuned in.
That is an incredibly elegant concept, almost beautiful. And from there, he makes this huge leap.
The huge leap. From observation to destruction. The logic is very mechanical, very much an engineer's way of thinking.
If a specific frequency of light makes an organism visible,
then that same frequency must hold some kind of power over its physical structure.
and this is where the famous tuning fork analogy comes from.
Right, everyone's seen this. An opera singer hits a high note, and a wine glass across the room shatters.
Because the sound frequency matches the natural resonant frequency of the glass.
Rife claimed the exact same principle applied to pathogens. Every bacterium, every virus, he said, vibrates at its own unique rate. If you could find that rate, you could then hit it with an external energy field of the same frequency.
And just amplify the vibration.
Until it literally shook itself apart. Until its structure was just catastrophically compromised.
The promise here, and this is why it was so appealing, was selective destruction.
Absolute specificity. That was the dream. If you tuned your machine to the frequency of, say, a cancer-causing microbe,
You could shatter that microbe without harming any of the healthy tissue right next to it.
Mm-hmm. Because the healthy cells are vibrating at a completely different rate. They wouldn't be affected at all. It was, in theory, the perfect magic bullet.
It completely reframes disease, doesn't it? It's no longer this chaotic biological mess. It's a mechanical problem with a simple physical solution.
A problem of resonance. And the cure is interference.
Which brings us to the term that he coined, the one that's central to this whole story, the mortal oscillatory rate, the MOR.
The MOR. It wasn't just a frequency. It was the one specific, precise vibrational threshold that would cause the organism to die.
Find the MOR, turn the dial, and the disease is gone.
That was the claim. And if he was right, you can see why people got so excited. No more poisons, no more cutting, no more burning, just a clean, precise application of physics.
It's so important, though, to not just look at the idea in a vacuum. You really have to place it in its historical context. His ideas didn't just appear out of nowhere. They landed in a world that was, I think, uniquely ready to hear them.
Absolutely. The early 20th century was a time of huge medical uncertainty.
There was this weird paradox going on. Science was getting really good at describing problems.
Right. Germ theory was established. Pathology was getting very sophisticated. They could diagnose things with more and more accuracy.
But the cures were lagging way behind, especially for something like cancer.
The treatments that existed were just brutal.
Horrifically so. Surgery for cancer was often radically disfiguring. And even then, recurrence was incredibly common because they couldn't be sure they got everything.
And then you had radiation. They had X-ray machines, but they really didn't have a sophisticated understanding of how that radiation interacted with human tissue.
It was like using an invisible sledgehammer.
It was. The line between a dose that might help and a dose that would cause devastating long-term damage was, well, it was blurry at best. A lot of guesswork.
And chemotherapy, as we think of it today, with targeted drugs that just didn't exist yet.
Not at all. So for many people, getting a cancer diagnosis was essentially a death sentence. And the treatment itself was this awful ordeal you had to endure. You had to survive the cure almost as much as the disease.
So you have this public that sees medicine able to name their illness, but often powerless to solve it in a humane way.
It created this huge intellectual and emotional space for a radical new idea.
And at the same exact time, the entire world was being reshaped by invisible forces.
Mm-hmm. This was the great cultural narrative of the age.
Think about it. X-rays were becoming common. Suddenly you could look inside a living person without a knife.
Radio waves were flying through the air, carrying voices across continents. It must have seemed like absolute magic.
And electricity was no longer just a scientific curiosity. It was lighting up cities, running factories. The invisible had become reliable, predictable, and incredibly powerful.
So when Rife comes along and talks about using invisible frequencies to cure disease, it doesn't sound like mysticism.
No, it sounds like the next logical step. It sounds like contemporary physics.
Exactly. If invisible waves can see through your skin, why couldn't a different kind of invisible wave disrupt a pathogen? It fits the technological story of the era perfectly.
And Rife himself was the perfect character to deliver this story. He was the classic archetype of the outsider innovator.
Yes. He wasn't part of the medical establishment, so he wasn't bound by its rules or, its failures. He was this obsessive tinkerer building these beautiful, complex machines by hand.
When people visited his lab, they weren't just hearing about an idea. They were seeing this incredibly sophisticated-looking equipment.
And he was very smart about the language he used.
Yeah.
He borrowed from hard science. Resonance, oscillation, frequency, wavelength. He presented himself as someone who was extending medicine with physics, not attacking it.
So in that specific moment in history, with medical confidence at a low point for these big diseases, a guy like Rife, with his complex machines and technical jargon, he doesn't look like a quack.
He looks like a genius.
Yeah.
Or at the very least, he looks like the future. The fact that he was an outsider just made his story even more compelling.
Okay, so let's zero in on the absolute epicenter of this whole thing, which is the microscope. Because if that part is true, everything else at least becomes plausible.
You're right. I mean, if he could really do what he said he could do with that microscope, he should have won a Nobel Prize for optics alone. Forget about the curing machine.
So he says he's using these custom quartz lenses, prisms, this beam ray illumination. The goal is to see these pathogens alive.
And his core philosophical point was that life is motion. It's vibration. By killing the specimen, conventional microscopy was missing the most essential part of what made it alive.
But this runs headfirst into a fundamental wall of physics, right? The problem of scale.
The problem of scale. Even back in the 1930s, scientists understood something called the diffraction limit of light.
And this is the critical technical point that often gets lost in the story.
It is. The diffraction limit basically says that you can't see an object that's smaller than about half the wavelength of the light you're using to look at it.
And viruses are much, much smaller than the wavelength of visible light.
Oh, orders of magnitude smaller. Which is why it's physically impossible to see them with a standard light microscope, no matter how good your lenses are. It's like trying to feel the texture of a single thread with a broomstick. The tool is just too crude for the target.
The electron microscope was just being developed around this time, and it could see viruses.
But only by using a beam of electrons, which have a much shorter wavelength. And even then you had to kill the specimen, dehydrate it, and put it in a vacuum. So it just seemed to confirm the rule. To see something that small, it has to be dead.
But Rife's claim, his extraordinary assertion, was that his method just rejected those rules.
He basically said he found a cheat code in physics. He insisted that by using resonance, visibility wasn't a function of size anymore. It was a function of synchronization. The light itself was making the organism reveal its location.
He was saying vibration could substitute for resolution.
Which is an extraordinary claim. And as the saying goes, extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof.
And that's where the whole thing falls apart. The proof never came.
Not in a way the scientific community could accept. There was no independent replication. He never published detailed schematics that would allow another lab to build his microscope and test it.
The demonstrations he did give were criticized for lacking controls, for not being blinded. The validation just failed to materialize.
And without that independent validation, the microscope changes its nature. It stops being a scientific instrument, and it becomes a kind of symbolic relic.
A device that exists right on the edge of what people desperately wanted to be true and what physics was willing to actually confirm.
And once that validation failed, the physical object wasn't as important as the faith that it inspired.
So from this unverified observation, he builds the therapeutic device. He's calculated the MRR, the mortal oscillatory rate.
Right. And now he needs a way to deliver that frequency to the patient's body.
Which is the Rife machine itself. What did it actually look like?
In its original form, it was a frequency generator, a pretty powerful one, that was connected to a glass tube filled with an inert gas, a plasma tube.
Okay.
When you turn it on and tune it to the right frequency, the MOR, the tube would glow with this faint light and emit an electromagnetic field at that exact frequency.
And the treatment was completely non-invasive.
Elegantly so. The patient would just sit or lie down near the tube. No wires, no electrodes, no physical contact. The energy was supposed to just pass through the body.
With the goal being what he called the physics of shattering.
The wine glass analogy again. The EM field from the machine would force any pathogen with a matching MOR into destructive resonance, and it would just fall apart. He called it being devitalized.
The appeal here is just so obvious. It's the promise of certainty.
Total certainty. It's not biology with all its messiness and probability. It's physics. It's an equation. If the frequency matches, the pathogen dies. Period. If it doesn't match, nothing happens.
It takes all the guesswork out of medicine.
It does. But that beautiful clarity hides this. Well, this central catastrophic flaw in the physics.
A misunderstanding of how EM energy actually behaves in the human body.
That's the core of the scientific critique. The human body is not a crystal wine glass sitting on a shelf in the air.
Right. It's mostly water. It's messy.
It's a highly heterogeneous, liquid-filled, and what physicists would call an extremely dampened environment.
What does that mean, dampened?
It means that when you introduce energy like this, it doesn't stay focused. It doesn't build up. It disperses almost immediately. It interacts broadly with water molecules, proteins, cell membranes, and it mostly just turns into heat.
So for Rife's theory to work, you'd need this energy to somehow ignore all of that.
Ignore trillions of healthy cells, travel through all that fluid, and selectively deliver all its mechanical force to one tiny little virus or bacteria.
And there's just no known physical mechanism that allows for that kind of selectivity.
None has ever been demonstrated. It would require the pathogen to have a physical property, a quality factor that is just wildly different from anything else around it, and biological tissues just don't work that way. The energy dissipates long before it could ever build up enough force to shatter something.
And on top of that, there wasn't even any agreement on what the frequencies were.
Another huge problem. A total lack of standardization. If you look at the surviving notes from Rife and his collaborators, the frequency tables, the lists of MORs for things like cancer or tuberculosis, they're all different.
So even if the physics worked, you wouldn't know which number to dial in.
Exactly. Without validated frequencies and standardized protocols, the whole thing was impossible to reproduce. The mechanism was broken from both ends. The physics was implausible, and the input data was unreliable.
And yet, despite these massive physical questions, the Rife story starts to gain real momentum, and it's driven by something much more powerful than data.
Oh, much more powerful. It was driven by the power of testimonials.
The story.
The stories. In a world that was just desperate for gentle, effective cures, the stories were irresistible. They circulated in newsletters, at lectures, by word of mouth.
And they were always so dramatic, right? Terminal patients, people who had been sent home to die by their doctors, suddenly making these incredible recoveries.
Tumors shrinking, pain vanishing. These weren't data points. They were emotionally powerful narratives. They fit that perfect story of the outsider genius who found the simple answer the establishment was too blind to see.
But when you look at those stories with a scientific eye, there are these huge gaping holes.
Critical omissions. There's no rigor. You look for controlled trials, you look for standardized protocols, for inclusion criteria. None of it is there.
And most importantly, there are no medical records.
Almost none. No contemporaneous records for independent review. No before and after x-rays. No verified pathology reports. No objective lab results to back up the stories.
So when the medical community started to push back on this, when they asked for that proof, what happened?
The narrative flipped. Skepticism was reframed as suppression. A request for evidence was seen as a hostile act from big medicine, trying to crush a revolutionary cure.
So the very lack of evidence becomes, in a way, proof of a conspiracy.
Exactly. It's a classic feature of these kinds of movements. The absence of proof isn't a failure of the theory. It's proof of how powerful the forces are that are trying to hide it. It actually strengthens the belief for the true believers.
And as this pressure starts to build through the 30s and 40s, Rife's whole professional world starts to fall apart.
It really does. You see fractures and destruction everywhere. Doctors who had maybe given him some early cautious support, people like Dr. Milbank Johnson, they start to publicly back away.
Saying what?
Saying that while the instruments were impressive to look at, the clinical results just weren't there. They were erratic, they couldn't be reproduced, and they were ultimately unsubstantiated.
And then the lawyers get involved.
Then the lawyers get involved. There were nasty legal fights over patents, over who owned the company, accusations of fraud. It turned into a series of really messy court battles between Rife and his own business partners.
And somewhere in all of that chaos, the physical evidence just vanishes.
It vanishes. Rife supporters have always claimed that during these legal battles, the original equipment, the unique microscopes, the frequency generators, was seized or deliberately destroyed.
Whether it was destroyed by angry partners or seized by a court order or just left to fall apart in a warehouse somewhere.
The result is the same. The physical foundation of the work disappeared. And without the original non-reproducible tools, the claims could never be independently tested again. They could never be falsified.
So the experiments stop, and the whole thing moves completely from the world of science into the world of legend.
And what's left is not data. It's just this powerful, resilient story of a cure that could have changed the world if only it hadn't been stolen.
So by the 1940s, Rife himself is basically a non-entity in the scientific world. He dies pretty quietly in 1971. But the idea doesn't die with him.
Not at all. It has this incredible post-war resurgence.
Why then?
I think it was a change in the cultural climate. After World War II, you have this growing skepticism of all authority, the government, big corporations, and definitely big medicine. And at the same time, the public fascination with invisible energy fields, radiation, electricity, it only gets deeper. So Rife's ideas felt modern, they felt a little rebellious, and they felt safe.
And new devices start showing up with his name on them.
Exactly. Often much simpler machines that didn't really have any technical connection to Rife's original complex setup. And the claims got much broader. It wasn't just for specific microbes anymore.
It was for everything.
Everything. Detoxification, balancing your bioenergetic field, and of course, curing cancer.
Which naturally gets the attention of regulators like the FDA.
Immediately, the FDA starts issuing warnings, seizing devices that were being marketed as unapproved medical treatments. The courts consistently sided with them.
So what did the manufacturers do? They couldn't say it cures anything anymore.
They did a very smart linguistic pivot. The language just shifted. The machines stopped being for treatment and started being experimental or educational.
Or for wellness.
That's the big one. Wellness. The claims softened. It wasn't about curing disease. It was about supporting the body's natural processes or promoting cellular equilibrium.
And that move is so critical because it takes the entire thing out of the realm of science, where a claim has to be provable, and puts it into the realm of a belief system.
Where the goals are subjective. You can't really measure balance, so it becomes immune to scientific refutation.
I think it's really important here to contrast Rife's idea with the way modern medicine actually uses energy. Because we do.
We absolutely do. Radiation oncology is a cornerstone of cancer treatment. We use radiofrequency ablation to literally burn tumors with heat. Focused ultrasound can destroy tissue non-invasively.
But the difference, and this is the whole ballgame right here, is the mechanism.
The mechanism of action. Modern energy therapies work by causing measurable, predictable damage. That's the whole point. Radiation shreds DNA. RFA cooks tissue. The damage is the mechanism.
It's a controlled destructive force.
Exactly. And medicine accepts the trade-offs, the side effects that come with that. Rife theory required the exact opposite, a kind of magical selectivity where there was zero collateral damage.
The idea that cancer cells have some unique frequency that you can target in isolation.
And that idea has been tested, and it has consistently failed.
Yeah.
All cells, healthy and cancerous, are fundamentally very similar in their physical properties. They interact with electromagnetic fields broadly. You can heat them, but you can't selectively shatter one type while leaving its neighbor untouched. The physics just isn't there.
So that brings us to the big question. If the physics is flawed, if the evidence isn't there, why does this idea not only persist but thrive? Why is it still so compelling?
Because I don't think it has anything to do with physics anymore. It's about psychology. It taps into some of our deepest, most powerful needs and desires about what we want medicine to be.
And the first one has to be that the core idea, resonance, is just such an intuitive metaphor.
It's so clean and mechanical, we get it instantly. Tuning a radio, a shattering glass, it makes sense to us in a way that, say, complex cellular biology just doesn't.
And life itself is so rhythmic, right? Hearts beat, neurons fire, so it feels natural to think of disease as being out of tune.
And Rife provides a machine that can supposedly tune you back up. It's a perfect fit for that intuition.
It also offers something modern medicine struggles with: precision without probability.
A huge psychological draw. Modern medicine is a world of statistics. Percentages, risk factors, side effects. It's almost never a sure thing.
Which is very unsatisfying and scary for a patient.
Incredibly.
Yeah.
But resonance offers this mechanical certainty. There's no probability. The frequency either matches or it doesn't. It turns this terrifying, chaotic illness into a solvable math problem.
Find the right number, turn the dial. That feeling of control must be immensely comforting.
Then there's the promise of power without invasion.
Most of our really effective treatments are invasive. Surgery, chemo, radiation, they leave scars, both physical and psychological. The treatment itself can feel like an assault.
Resonance is the opposite. The energy is invisible. There's no cutting, no poison. It reframes healing not as a battle, but as a restoration of harmony. For someone exhausted by brutal treatments, that is an incredibly powerful, almost utopian vision.
And lastly, it gives you the comfort of a single cause.
Yes. Complex diseases like cancer have complex causes. Genetics, environment, immunology, just bad luck. It's a tangled, scary mess.
But resonance theory collapses all that complexity down to one single understandable problem, one bad frequency.
And if there's one single problem, there can be one single fix. It takes this huge existential threat and turns it into a discrete, technical glitch that can be corrected.
So even when the evidence doesn't support the theory, that emotional logic is so powerful that it just doesn't matter. The idea survives because we need it to.
I think so. In the end, the story of Rife is a classic case of a powerful metaphor, completely outrunning its scientific mechanism.
The idea of resonance works great in simple, clean, engineered systems.
But the human body is the opposite of that. It's wet, it's messy, it's noisy, it's designed to absorb and dampen energy. The physics works on paper, in an analogy, but not in biology.
And he existed at this perfect moment in time where the language of science, frequency, vibration had all this authority, but the tools to actually test his claims in a rigorous way just weren't there yet.
So I think the persistence of his legacy is, at its heart, psychological. It's a legacy of longing. It reveals this deep human desire for medicine to be something it currently isn't. Perfectly precise, totally humane, and completely merciful.
He offered a vision of healing without suffering, where disease isn't an enemy to be fought, but just a technical problem to be corrected.
And that idea, that hum of an invisible perfect cure, it speaks to our deepest hope that illness can be fixed without punishment. The Rife machine itself failed. Biology wouldn't cooperate. But that belief, That desire for a painless, elegant solution, that's extraordinarily difficult to silence.
It just continues to hum right there at the edge of science, always asking us to believe.
Until next time.